Hello and welcome to The Steamy, the Scotsman's politics podcast. I'm Alistair Grant, the political editor of The Scotsman. It's a downfall like nothing else in modern Scottish political history. Peter Murrell, the former chief executive of the SNP, and Nicola Sturgeon's estranged husband, was sentenced to more than 5 years in prison after admitting embezzling more than £400,000 from the party over a 12-year period. Judge Lord Young said Murrell had committed a calculated crime of dishonesty, while his defence lawyer painted a grim picture of a broken and isolated man with a bleak future ahead of him. But it's safe to say this sorry saga is not over yet. Opposition politicians say that Nicola Sturgeon and other senior SNP figures still have serious questions to answer amid mounting calls for an inquiry. And this week it emerged that the team behind Operation Branchform, the name given to the police probe into the SNP's finances, had further questions for Nicola Sturgeon even after she was interviewed by police under caution and had submitted a written statement. Later on in the podcast, we'll also talk about the other minor story of the week, the small matter of Keir Starmer's resignation as Prime Minister and the likely elevation of Andy Burnham to Downing Street. But first, to talk all things Peter Murrell, I'm joined by Martyn McLaughlin, the Scotsman's investigations correspondent, David Bol, the Scotsman's deputy political editor, and by political correspondent Rachel Amery. Martyn, you wrote a piece in which you spoke to Crown Office and police contacts to get some of the background behind the extraordinary investigation into Peter Murrell's crimes. What did you find out?
Yeah, obviously, Operation Branchform, as it was known, Alistair, was one of the most high-profile investigations in modern Scottish history. But when you boil down to what it actually involved, it was relatively straightforward in terms of a police investigation. The whole operation was led by the Scottish Crime Campus at Gartcosh, which is a real team of economic fraud specialists. Ordinarily, their kind of remit covers things like human trafficking, cyber fraud, international money laundering. But when it came to the crimes of Peter Murrell, it was really just a case of looking at the SNP's bank accounts, looking at the SNP's financial accounting system, and just seeing how the two didn't tally up. Lord Young himself, pointed out this was not a particularly sophisticated crime, and I don't think Peter Murrell went to any great attempts to stop him, even after it became public knowledge that the police were investigating the party. His spending spree continued. So in that respect, he didn't attempt to cover his tracks in any way. What made things slightly more complex for the police and prosecutors was just the sheer length of time this had been going on for. They were looking at spending data going all the way back to 2010. Police managed to get bank records and records from individual retailers that Murrell used. But the suspicion is that the sheer amount of purchases that he completed using SNP cash may never be known in full, because there's only a certain amount of time that this kind of data is held for. So what the police and prosecutors presented and what was ultimately prosecuted was a case where this is the best known sum total of what Peter Murrell was doing. But I think there will be suspicions that there were even more purchases over the years.
And your background, Joe, people should go onto the Scotsman's website and read it in full because it's absolutely fascinating. But you have a sort of section of it that talks about when the kind of early stage when red flags were raised about the possibility of embezzlement. And people might remember that this police investigation was kicked off because of complaints about something else entirely, complaints about what had happened to a £600,000 ring-fenced independence referendum fund that the SNP had kind of crowdfunded for. There's activists that were raising concerns about where that money had gone. John Swinney's recently admitted it was sort of just spent on general party business and campaigning. But can you talk about the moment when the police sort of became aware that something else was afoot?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. This Operation Branchform in the investigation, it ostensibly started off as a fraud investigation. We know that Sean Clarkin and 13 other complainants raised concerns about the SNP's finances, and the majority of those complaints centred around, like you say, that fund, or what was thought to be a fund that was allocated for a new referendum on Scottish independence. Now, the SNP had mentioned that over the years, this was a ring-fenced fund, but I think in terms of what prosecutors interpret it as, the word ring-fenced was political rhetoric. There was no way of discerning the different funds within the SNP's accounts. There was just the one central bank account, and all the money that came in just went into this one account. So there was no separation. So in that respect, the use of the word ring fence made it difficult, I think, for police and prosecutors to identify any fraud. And so it naturally, over the course of their investigations, they started looking through the payments. The focus of what they were looking at switched. I think a big red flag moment came at one point when the SNP had lost a fair few number of seats. Quite a lot of its donors had abandoned it, and its finances were in reasonably a reasonably perilous state compared to what they'd been a few years previously. But around that same time, the SNP had been spending, or Murrell had been spending, using the SNP's money, numerous transactions on Le Creuset crockery and cups. And I think that just was a kind of alarm bell. It said, the police questioned Murrell about this and his purchase of pens, because it simply didn't tally up. At a time when the party's finances were flagging, why was it spending this amounts of money on what was ostensibly middle class homeware? And I think that was the real starting point for their investigation, which focused from then on into Murrell's embezzlement.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of chuckling there when you were talking about that, and particularly when I saw the kind of police, the videos that were released after Peter Murrell's sentencing, when you saw the kind of police interview, and there's one where the detective is literally asking him about the almost 20 grand that he'd spent on pens, just talking about the extraordinary amount of money that was.
Of that amount, over £19,000 is exclusively on pens alone. It's quite frankly an outrageous amount of money to be spending on pens, in my opinion. What about your opinion? You bought them. You must have an opinion on them, Peter. What does the SNP need over £19,000 of luxury pens for?
Obviously, embezzlement is a serious crime, but there's just so many sort of ridiculous elements to this. It's hard not to laugh at some of it. But we should touch on one of the kind of things that was focused on yesterday. We're recording this on Wednesday. But Nicola Sturgeon provided both Police Scotland and the Crown Office of what she said was a very detailed written document answering the questions that had been put to me. People might remember that she was arrested and released without charge back in 2023. But the Scotsman, other newspapers as well, understand that although the written statement she submitted answered some of the questions investigators had, there were further questions police would have liked to have asked Nicola Sturgeon. Can you talk a wee bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. As you say, Nicola Sturgeon was interviewed by police under caution at Falkirk Police Station, where it's quite well reported that she gave what's known as a no-comment interview on the advice of her lawyer. Where ostensibly any question she was asked, she responded with no comment. Subsequently to that, she did provide what she's described as a very detailed statement to the police, picking up on some of the questions that they answered her. We don't know the length of that statement. We don't know the kind of issues it touched on. Miss Sturgeon herself has said that there is a possibility that she could release that statement. Whether she does so is entirely up to her and based on her own legal advice, but I think that would answer a lot of the public questions surrounding what she was asked and what she answered. But you're absolutely right in terms of that statement that was provided to police. It didn't satisfy investigators fully. There was kind of outstanding questions that I think the police were keen to explore in more detail. And the police took advice from the Crown Office on this, and they basically decided at that stage in the investigation not to pursue those questions again. So Miss Sturgeon has had no further involvement with police or prosecutors since that stage. But that's one thing in terms of the criminal investigation. Politically, the pressure on Miss Sturgeon to disclose that document, I think, will intensify, not just from her, but on the part of the SNP. There are huge questions still to be answered around the party's finances, and fundamentally the lack of curiosity on the part of senior figures at the party at the time and now, which persists. There's a lot of stonewalling effectively around really legitimate questions surrounding money that was given by ordinary members of the public to the party in good faith, and I think those questions will continue even after the sentencing.
Yeah, David, we should maybe touch on that a bit more, because there's lots of renewed calls for an inquiry into this whole saga yesterday, both from the opposition parties in Holyrood, the Scottish Conservatives, Scottish Labour, also from figures like Joanna Cherry, the former high-profile SNP MP. I mean, those calls aren't going to go away, are they?
No, I think the SNP hope they will. They do this with a lot of things. We see this, all parties do it. They kind of just hope it will go away. We've got recess coming up, and maybe by the time we get back, people will have forgotten about it. But I'm not sure that's going to be the case in this time. It does feel like there are still lots of questions. And John Swinney yesterday spoke at length to journalists about kind of what he's put in place to make sure this doesn't happen again. Whereas there's three eyes that have to look at everything that's signed off, where we found out that Peter Murrell was basically just, he could sign off his own expenses. There was no one sort of looking over his shoulder at what he was doing. But there are still huge questions over how he was able to get away with it for so long. And in court yesterday, we heard that the only reason he stopped doing it is because he got caught. He kind of couldn't stop doing this, and it was only the fact that the authorities were alerted to his behaviour that put it to an end. So there are loads of questions. Obviously, those donations that some of the members gave that have gone missing as well, they want answers to where their money went, and they haven't been provided with those answers yet as to why Peter Murrell did this. The judge said yesterday as well that he couldn't see any reason as to why. There was no explanation as to why this behaviour was carried out. But the questions really for the SNP are just how no one asked questions. Like was mentioned a minute ago, the SNP's finances were under strain. We knew that, and why no one was really looking at it in depth raises eyebrows, and opposition parties are going to pile in with this. I don't think this is kind of going to go away. There's a few in Labour who think it would have if it had happened, this had all come out before the election, it would have had an impact. Not sure how true that is, but they're obviously quite sore about it, and I don't think they're going to let this drop anytime soon, to be honest.
And David, you were in court yesterday for the sentencing. I mean, what was Peter Murrell's body language like? What was he like when that 5 year and 3 months sentence was read out?
There wasn't much to it, actually. He didn't react particularly to it, and the lawyers pointed out that he was deeply ashamed and embarrassed by that guilty plea we got a month ago from him. And I think that is true. It was quite obvious to see that he is just very ashamed of what's happened, and the fact that it's so public. And he's become a public ridicule figure, really. He's going to be, when he does get out of prison, he's going to find it very hard to shake that. And I think that reputation for Nicola Sturgeon as well was going to be difficult, because she's obviously wanting to move away from Scottish politics, that she enjoys London and things. But if she becomes a kind of a butt of a joke down there, it's going to be very difficult for her to kind of move on. But yeah, in court he didn't say anything. He just kind of sat there and listened to it very cautiously, and then he was away again. It was quite a surreal atmosphere, to be honest. That he was so quiet and didn't really move a muscle, to be perfectly frank.
David, you mentioned that journalists spoke to John Swinney in the Scottish Parliament. Here's a clip of John Swinney when he was asked whether he forgives Peter Murrell.
Can we clarify Lindsay's question on forgiveness? Do you forgive him?
Well, I've tried to give an explanation to all of this. I am a person of faith. I believe in forgiveness. But please, Colin, I'm not going to say any more about that. It's a deeply personal point about how I feel about other human beings, and I'm not going to be any more specific about this. I've explained the hurt and the distress that I feel. Now, I am very much engaged in answering the detailed and follow-up questions, but I ask for a little bit of respect on this question, because you're exploring questions about how I feel about my faith, which are a matter for me. And on this particular question, Colin, it is agony.
That was First Minister John Swinney speaking to journalists in the Scottish Parliament on Tuesday. And Rachel, David touched on this a little bit, but the judge, Lord Young himself, said it was difficult to get a clear picture around what drove Peter Murrell's actions, particularly given that some of the items bought by Murrell with the embezzled money were not even used. And there was also a reference in court to a social work report in which Murrell had kind of mentioned possible factors behind his offending, his background, working life, personal circumstances, but no details were made public. And it's incredibly intriguing because one of the big questions here is why on earth this sort of unassuming, slightly grey, boring man did this. And that's still largely a complete mystery.
Yes, so many of the items, like you said, weren't used. There was doubles of some items. I mean, if you looked in the list, there's the multiples of certain things that he was purchasing. I think probably the most famous of all these items was this £125,000 motorhome, which, as we learned in the past month, was only got 4 miles on the clock, I think it was. Basically been driven from the dealership to his parents' house. It hadn't gone any further than that. And so I think a lot of people were really expecting in this statement in court yesterday for there to be some details to what happened, what the motivations were, what he was thinking, what he was doing with the purchases that he made, because that's a lot of the detail that we wanted to know. Now, as you said, there was a criminal justice social work report. It was referred to yesterday, and it was basically saying that he was unable to stop offending, and that's what happened there. But in terms of what the root cause was, I think we're still left trying to answer that question at this point in time. That detail is something that wasn't got into yesterday, and I think a lot of us were expecting to get that detail, and we haven't had that yet.
Yeah, he's almost like a complete enigma. And I think lots of journalists will be clamouring to interview him at some point in the future. Whether or not he will ever accept that, who knows? But like I say, this saga is not over yet. You can guarantee we've not heard the last of the Murrell scandal. Martyn, thank you very much for joining us and for talking us through the piece that you've written on this, which, as I say, people should read on the Scotsman's website. But to move on to the other big news of the week, pretty much the biggest news you can get in politics, actually, really, and that's the resignation of Keir Starmer as Prime Minister, or announcing the kind of timeline for his resignation, and the seemingly unstoppable ascent of Andy Burnham. And as we record this, Andy Burnham is the only leadership candidate. There's all sorts of speculation about who he's going to appoint as his Chancellor, for example. There's names floating around. Wes Streeting, the former leadership contender, until he pulled out. Ed Miliband, again, another name that's being mentioned. And there's also all sorts of chat about what Andy Burnham's policy platform is actually going to be. What is his vision for the country? Rachel, where are we at this point in time? And when might Andy Burnham take the reins?
Yes, I mean, of all the weeks for Andrew Quinn, our Westminster correspondent, to go off to the World Cup, the week that the Prime Minister resigns. So we were very much starting to expect this to happen over the weekend. I think on Friday last week, the Prime Minister was still saying that he wanted to stand in any leadership contest. The rules of the Labour Party means if there is a leadership contest, the incumbent Prime Minister automatically gets to stand. So he was very much saying, no, I'm wanting to carry on. I will stand against anyone who challenges me. And he was apparently phoning around his cabinet ministers as well on Friday, trying to shore up that support for him. And obviously over the weekend, things developed. It became clearer and clearer that wasn't going to happen. And there became quite a change in tone from cabinet ministers. It went to from being, yes, he's confident and yes, we back him, to he's weighing up his political future. And we could sort of see that we were expecting that to happen on Monday. And so we were all waiting with bated breath on the screens. Everyone's eyes were on Downing Street to see if the lectern would come out. And it did. And I think we also got a hot lectern guy as well. He came back out as well. They're probably the most stable, apart from Larry the Cat, the most stable feature of 10 Downing Street at the moment. So we had that on Monday. Hours later, Andy Burnham was sworn in as an MP. We should mention there were 2 Scottish MPs also sworn in at the same time. Lara Bird, the new MP for Arbroath and Broughty Ferry, and Douglas Lumsden, the new MP for Aberdeen South. both, however, very much overshadowed by other events of the day on Monday. And it was quite fascinating because there was all these journalists on the train with Andy Burnham. There was then cameras sort of crowding around him in Euston Station when he arrived in London. There was a helicopter following his taxi to the Houses of Parliament. I mean, we were kind of acting like he was already the Prime Minister in the way the media kind of dealt with that situation, which was quite interesting to see that at the time. Now, he is very much the favourite. He's the only one that's saying, yes, I am going to stand. We were expecting that maybe Darren Jones might. He's the Chief Secretary of the Prime Minister, but we're recording this on Wednesday, and this morning he pulled out and said, no, I am going to be backing Andy Burnham. We understand that he had some conversations with Andy Burnham about the economic policy and feels that he's now reassured that what he's planning to do is good enough, and that's why he has pulled out. We're still waiting to see what Al Carnes is going to do. Aberdeen-born MP who up until very recently was the Armed Forces Minister. We're still waiting to hear what he's going to say, because there's also speculation that he might stand more just so that there wasn't a coronation for Andy Burnham, as opposed to a serious he could challenge him. So that's what we're waiting for at the moment. I believe nominations, let me just double check this one, I think it's the 9th of July. Yes, it is. The 9th of July is when nominations for leadership officially open, and they close on the 15th of July. And that means if Andy Burnham is the only person standing, we could see him as Prime Minister, within the next month. It could be very, very quick. If there is a contest, it'll take a bit longer, but Sir Keir Starmer in his resignation speech did say there would be somebody in place by the end of the summer recess at Westminster. So for certain, by September, we will have a new Prime Minister. By a month's time, we also could have a Prime Minister, depending on how things go.
Yeah, and David, we should talk. I mean, we mentioned the fact that people are speculating as to what Andy Burnham will stand for, what his vision will be. We should talk about what that means for Scotland, which is kind of the primary thing that we're interested in. And you've been looking into this, what Andy Burnham has said in the past about Scotland, what he could potentially do. I thought it was quite interesting that Scottish Labour leader Anna Sarwar was sort of asked about the leadership contest following Starmer's resignation announcement, and was using quite strong language, talking about Labour being in the fight of their lives, talking about a battle for the heart and soul of the country as they kind of seek to take on Reform UK. Anna Sarwar obviously saying that Labour are the only party placed to do that. But what are your thoughts on this in terms of what this means for Scotland and what Andy Burnham could mean?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, it's absolutely wild that he's kind of waltzed in from a by-election victory and then straight into Downing Street with no questions asked. But we don't know what his leadership would look like in detail. He probably doesn't know yet because, I mean, a few weeks ago he was running a regional council. So in terms of Scotland, we know he's a big kind of fan of devolution. He's kind of championed that in the north of England. But there's nothing to indicate that he would want more powers going to Holyrood. If anything, from what he said in the past, he would like power pushed out of Holyrood into kind of the cities and regions, which is something that Anna Sarwar has talked about before. But again, that would require someone in the Scottish government being from the Labour Party, which doesn't look like happening anytime soon. On oil and gas, he doesn't even really have an opinion. He's quite frank. He's like, I haven't really formed an opinion on oil and gas. That was less than a month ago. He was asked during the by-election campaign, which maybe raises a few alarm bells, particularly in the northeast, I have to say. I mean, to be fair to Labour, I know they've got a lot of criticism for the North Sea and the energy, but it's kind of the one thing that Keir Starmer stuck to. It was his one kind of policy and identity that didn't change. So it would be quite something if he did come in and just rip that up. And I don't really think he will, to be honest. But I do think it'll be a bit more measured. I think there's obviously two parts to it. There's the licensing, which they vowed to kind of get rid of, although the Rosebank and Jackdaw developments, which we're still to know if they're going to get approved, would probably be able to be approved and that still stick because they're just looking for environmental consent. But there's the tax part of it, which, I mean, Labour have come under so much pressure for waiting till 2030 to reform the energy profits levy. And Rachel Reeves said she was about to do it before the Iran war kind of kicked off, and that's what's stopped it. But I can see that being a potential easy win for him in the northeast without having to kind of redraw those licensing plans, which obviously Ed Miliband has championed, and he is a very close ally of Andy Burnham. So we'll just have to wait and see. But I think that could be a potential area where we could see some movement. Everything else, though, we just don't know. Like all politicians, he's changed his mind quite a few times on his kind of stance. To give him credit, he is a politician that does kind of connect with the public a bit better than a lot of the Labour politicians we've seen at Westminster. So, as you mentioned, I think the biggest asset that Scottish Labour and we can see for Scotland is someone who has taken on reform in the by-election and beaten them quite comfortably. And I think that's one of Keir Starmer's many problems he got into, was trying to kind of pander to reform and reform voters, and it just didn't work. It never works. You can just ask Russell Finlay about that, how trying to be kind of a reform light just doesn't work. If the real deal's right there, people will vote for it. I would get the impression that Andy Burnham would not go down that route, but we'll just have to wait and see. I imagine there's a lot of work that he's having to put in now, particularly as Rachel said, he could be Prime Minister within a month. A contest would actually suit Andy Burnham, I think, because it would give him more time to actually get his stuff in order. So we'll just have to wait and see. But he'll, as Anna Sawar and sort of Labour insiders have said, we'll need to know pretty soon what his vision for Scotland is. And Anna Sawar is facing his own questions about his future. He's very close to Andy Burnham. We also thought he was close with Keir Starmer, to be fair, before he kind of did him in. But we'll just have to wait and see whether he thinks that an Andy Burnham leadership would give him a bit more time to set out his plans for Scottish Labour as well, and whether they would be able to kind of put the election behind them and think, well, the problem has gone now, we can just kind of move forward. But he hasn't got any pressure to resign, I think, is the issue at the moment for Scottish Labour, so he's just going to carry on. But this will be he wouldn't endorse Andy Burnham explicitly the other day when he talked to journalists, but you can tell he would definitely welcome Andy Burnham being in Downing Street.
Well, we will have to wait and see what happens, but that's all we've got time for this week. And I should say we are taking a short break as a podcast because Holyrood is going into its summer recess. We'll be off for the month of July unless something absolutely crazy happens, in which case we'll probably come back on and do a podcast. But if it doesn't, we'll be back at the beginning of August when there'll be lots of stuff happening during the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. There's always political events there, high-profile figures appearing with lots to say. But until then, thank you very much for listening. Please stay tuned to the Scotsman's website for all the latest news, comment, analysis. Please subscribe as well, and do check out our YouTube channel. Thank you very much.